Welcome back to the Wokeademia podcast. Today,
Sorry, go ahead.
Today I have. Should I start over?
Start over.
Oh yeah, sorry. All right. So, welcome back to the Wokeademia podcast. Today we're very happy to be joined by Todd Zwicky. He's a law professor at George Mason University, extremely well published, and he has a background in law and economics, amongst other things. And before, we're always supposed to start our public events now with a land acknowledgement. And at this point, I don't see how it can get any worse, so let's just give the campus back to the Comanches. I'm all for that. So on that note, Todd's going to talk to us a bit about woke law, and then we'll have a discussion on that.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here. And this is something I got interested in about a year ago to try to figure out what the essence of woke law is, because woke ideas are out there, but it has not really got as much traction in a lot of places as in law. And law is the sort of the real test for these sorts of ideas, because that's where the rubber really hits the road. And we're seeing it, and people are trying to understand. If you look around the country, for example, at all these prosecutors that we hear so much about who are soft on crime, and with ideas like divvying up board seats in public corporations by diversity, and just a whole host of ideas that kind of fly under the same flag that we can call woke law, although apparently they don't like that branding, so they're trying to rebrand it to get away from that idea. And so I wanted to figure out what it was, and in particular to figure out, is this just old wine in new bottles, old ideas from the 60s and 70s, Ralph Nader and ideas like that, or is there something new here? And I think it's a little bit of both, but there is something new here. And I think it's a very powerful set of ideas and very threatening set of ideas to capitalism, the rule of law, freedom generally. And it's threatening for two real reasons, which is first is there is a kernel of truth to some of the things that these people say. And second, it is a internally coherent set of ideas. And so if you were to take, say, my ideas, basically a Hayekian believer in the rule of law and spontaneous order in the free society, and take it and turn it upside down, you would get woke law. And so basically to the same extent that my ideas, I feel like, are a coherent whole that lead to freedom, they have basically the exact opposite set of ideas that are internally coherent, and makes it very challenging. And so I've identified three real elements of this kind of coherent worldview. The first is that hierarchies are largely arbitrary and corrupt and reflect power and privilege, not competence and merit. And so this is the kind of idea that basically your race or your gender or your sexuality is just as good of a qualification to be on a board of directors, for example, of a public corporation. Because if hierarchies are not competence-based, if hierarchies are based on privilege, status, that sort of thing, then that makes sense. And we could talk about that in their view, and that makes sense. And obviously, this is where there's a kernel of truth, which is hierarchies are somewhat arbitrary, right? The children of the the privileged and powerful have some credence, right? I'm going to just go out on a limb and say maybe Hunter Biden didn't get on the Burisma board of directors purely on the basis of his knowledge of oil and gas in Ukraine. So we know that there are things like that. The second idea is that processes and procedures, which have been the heart of sort of the liberal society as we've understood it since the 18th century, such as the rule of law, constitutional rules, extra-legal norms of fairness, equality, all these sorts of things, those are all suspect to the woke world, because they are status quo and privilege preserving arbitrary rules, and they should all be subordinated to the idea of equity and results, not equality and opportunity. And so this is what creates this sort of doubt, cast legitimacy on or a doubt on all of legitimacy, so that, for example, the criminal justice system should be judged not by whether or not trials are fair, but whether or not trials get the right result according to what the woke people think should be the right result. And this is, for example, why free speech doesn't make any sense to the woke idea. And I hope that's something we'll come back to later, which has very deep roots in this, and is one of the great places where I think we've misunderstood what they are doing. I think the third idea that is a key idea here is that individuals are not rational, autonomous thinkers and choosers who are responsible for their own actions and beliefs, but we are fundamentally shaped and fundamentally creatures of our identity and environment. So we cannot, for example, reason with each other. We cannot sort of, that a black transgendered person cannot meaningfully have a conversation with a cisgendered white male to come to any shared sense of truth. Number one, because there is no truth, and second, because we are so shaped by our environments that we are unable to kind of cross those identitarian lines. And so this is one of the things we see, this idea that we're not really rational thinkers. This underlies a lot of these criminal justice reform ideas, right? If you don't believe that people are responsible for their own actions, it's a pretty short line to basically say all criminal law is unjust, illegal, improper, right? Because you basically say, what choice does somebody have if they're the victim of an oppressive system? And so I think this is what animates a lot of these things in these big cities where we've seen these huge crime surges, is a rationale that the idea of individual responsibility for criminal behavior, for example, is not a meaningful concept. So we're seeing in a number of these places where these ideas very quickly filter down into on-the-ground impacts. So and so that's, and these are all ideas. They have, as I said, there's some credence to them. There is some legitimacy to each of these. And the problem is then the challenge is how do we deal with that? How do we acknowledge the kernels of truth without the kernels of truth sort of expanding and taking over everything and essentially effectively destroying this great civilization that we've built up?
Well, thanks. That's a great introduction. Maybe that's a segue into the first question. You keep going back to this. There's some legitimacy to some of the complaints. Can we interpret this as sort of like, it seems like it's if things are not perfect, right, then the only solution is give us all power. Is that part of that? Is that what's kind of falling out of this system? Because it is, this idea that things aren't perfect doesn't seem that novel. It's like mechanisms don't always work. There's always unfairness, but they seem to have taken that to a different level. So is that a fair description?
Yeah, I think that's right. And if you talk to especially some of the younger people, I asked a younger person this recently. I said, when I was trying to figure this out, I said, what do they want? What do they want? When will they be satisfied? Right? Is it a certain economic power or whatever? And she thought for a minute, very thoughtful kid and high school kid, and said, when it's their turn to be in charge, when the oppressors have taken their turn as the oppressed for some period of time. And so that's the weird part about it, Rich, is that they don't really have a positive agenda. It's more of a destructive agenda, which is sort of a payback type thing. And one of the things that is especially galling and I think, frankly, appalling about the fact that this woke ideology has become sort of an elite sort of idea is who is the one who ends up suffering? It's actually the people they claim to speak for, right? The low-income minorities, immigrants, the ones who have the least power in society. We see this, for example, in this recent thing with the San Francisco school board getting recalled. It was basically working-class families who said, enough, we want our kids to learn, not be indoctrinated. We see this in who's bearing the brunt of the crime in the big cities who are coming about, being suffered under all these sorts of things. And so there is this kind of posturing about it that kind of goes along with it that sort of throws the people they claim to be speaking for under the bus. And partly it has to do with the fact is they don't really have any coherent sense of what would be better than we have, and whether what they're actually doing is making things better or worse for the people they claim to be helping.
Yeah, so that's an interesting observation on their objectives, because with the sort of people who are not enthusiastic about these woke ideas but seem more sympathetic, there's this, I hear a lot of this discussion of there's a trade-off between, they interpret their system as saying there's a trade-off between individual freedoms and the need to help marginalized groups. But I have a sense that when you really look at it, the sort of hatred for the sort of regular working class seems to be driving, especially on a campus, like the sort of things people say about like regular working class types. That seems like the simpler, sort of more parsimonious model, because exactly they're pushing policies that very much hurt regular people, but also, incidentally hurt these marginalized classes. So it does seem like the revenge and the hate maybe is a bit more to it than any type of actual concern for the marginalized.
And I think that's right. And so what you see is the other part of this is that the elites, the establishment, the people who have the wealth to opt out, right, say to send their kids to private school in San Francisco while they vote for school board people who will shut down the public schools and do all this sort of stuff. Partly what it is they realize it doesn't really threaten them. The rich people, they're gonna get their board seats. They're gonna get their kids, they'll buy their kids to college if they need to do that. And so basically,
we have a system for that. You just pay to make it look like he's on the tennis team. You're fine.
That's right.
It's all well established.
That's right. And so basically, they've kind of come up with a good racket here where they can sort of, virtue signal is exactly the right word, where they make all these noises, but they're largely insulated for the consequences of their own policy. And so it really is, I think a lot of it is, this is their way of basically turning up their nose at ordinary working class people while they show how noble they are by making other people sacrifice their opportunities and that sort of thing.
And particularly, it seems particularly effective at making sure sort of the striving working class, like the kid who might make it into the managerial class and the leadership class gets crushed on his way up, because you can throw him off overboard as a racist, while your kid who's had all the polished training to say the right thing goes on. So it is kind of. Seems like a bit of a coalition going.
Look at the alliance to basically get rid of standardized tests in college admissions. You have sort of the woke crowd who supports that for their reasons, but then the rich people know the less merit there is, the more money and connections matters. And so I think there is kind of an interesting projection here, which is one of the things that's striking to me on this first point I made about hierarchies are largely corrupt and arbitrary and reflect power and not merit is Emily Ekins did a fascinating poll a few years ago at the Cato Institute. She's a brilliant pollster, and she asked people's attitudes towards capitalism. And she asked the question, how do people get rich in America? And self-described progressives said the three greatest causes of wealth in America are family connections, inheritance, and luck. And I think some of that may be projection.
If you're a progressive, that's probably true, because you don't have the ability to. Sorry.
No, but if you have that worldview, you are not going to be a capitalist. And what you discovered is among younger people, that's on all those questions is 20% higher among sort of millennials and Gen Z types than it was among the public at large. And of course, conservatives said things like hard work, education, stuff like that. And then when they asked why are people poor, the primary answer was discrimination, an unfair economic system. Those were the first two, and then lack of education. So what we're talking about is a really comprehensive worldview that these people hold that is fundamentally incompatible with this idea of striving, as you said, or that people can get ahead, or that the free market is in any way a fair and equitable system. And again, this is one of those things where their outrage is appropriate in the sense that we do have a system now that is too cronyist, right? We have too much crony capitalism in this country. We have too many regulations that favor entrenched interest, that lock people out by occupational licensing, by, policies that drive up the cost of college. I mean, so many things really are problematic, but they're caused by government regulation, almost every single one of them, not by the economic system. It's by the interventions that do it. And so they've kind of diagnosed a problem, yes, but the solution is not to create a system that's even more Byzantine and more expensive, so only the wealthiest and most sophisticated know how to get ahead and make their way through that bureaucracy.
Right. And that's sort of back to the there are problems, but instead of incrementally fixing the problems using the toolkit we've developed since the Enlightenment,
right,
we just have to throw everything out and assume this half-baked stuff that we've come up with, which I would say, you're able to put this in a coherent framework. Do you think they have, is this sort of something, is your coherent framework something they're conscious of, or is this just, does it take too much IQ to fit it all into the...
I'm not. I mean, it's funny you say that, which is I feel like I understand it better than they do, having kind of dissected it and kind of looked at the history of it, right? Which is it's not quite even clear where these ideas come from. And you and I have had this conversation before flying, right? Which is, where do these ideas come from? They seem to just germinate on Twitter somewhere, and all of a sudden something that you never heard of before just becomes sort of woke doctrine, dogma, right? That you can't question.
Recolonizes universities so quickly. It's like the universities aren't even the thought leaders anymore as much as the accelerants and followers. I don't know if you've ever read Foucault's Pendulum, but it starts to remind me of this. It's a Umberto Eco book about all these conspiracy theories, and it turns out they have to go to the guy who all these people think they're in a conspiracy, and they have to go to the guy who's studying the conspiracy and made it all up to figure out what's really
true.
They don't. It has that sort of
they've got this great
insane feel to it.
And there is. I mean, you mentioned the academy, and this is why a lot of people say, well, isn't this just Marxism, right? How is this any different? And the difference is, Marxism, communism failed because it made essentially empirically testable predictions, right? We will make you wealthy and free, right? And it turned out that was obviously untrue. These guys are more subtle, which is they basically deny that, right? That there's no way to do it. And so, good example to your question, they can diagnose a problem, but what's the solution? Here's what I like to think of. Let's think about a thought experiment. Let's say we go into downtown Philadelphia or Chicago or something, or take two cities, and in city A, we keep doing what we've been doing for the last 50 years, but more, right? We do more regulation. We do more power to the teachers' unions. We do more power to the public employee unions. We have, layers of regulation, occupational licensing, and all that sort of stuff. More land use controls, right? And then we go in city B, and we get rid of the teachers' unions and allow school choice, and we get rid of the public employee unions, and we get rid of the minimum wage, and we get rid of occupational licensing. And now tell me, if we came back in 10 years, who's going to be doing better, the people in city A or in city B, right? And I'd be willing to bet a lot of money that you're going to be a lot better off in city B.
In fact, I'd buy real estate.
I'd buy real estate in city B. That's right. But one of the things that's so interesting about this is the way they approach this is, and we see this so much with the pandemic and other areas, is their approach to it as well. Why hasn't it worked for 50 years? We did everything the experts told us we should do, right? We did public housing, and we poured money into the schools. We did what the expert told us to do, and things still aren't better. Well, that just shows that these policies that these corruptions, that these ideas are so deeply rooted in American society that they can't even be fixed by normal policy goals. We have to re-engineer all of society, people's psychology, to go after systemic racism. It's so deeply rooted that we've got to go all the way to systemic racism and not just change the policies. And that's what's really kind of diabolical about it, is that, they can just say more. And then when you say, well, people aren't racist anymore, they say, but they're implicitly racist.
And why isn't everything perfect then? Right.
Right.
And that does get to this question of how they use evidence, which I'm going to lead into a discussion of what is the appropriate role for this stuff at a university or in education, because there's been talk about sort of removing some of this. My sense is the process through which we reach decisions, even with people we really disagree with, has some, we want it tied to some sort of reasoning and evidence-based thing. They seem fairly explicitly rejecting that. And then one wonders, if you don't even want to have that type of conversation, what are you doing in an institution that exists only for having that type of conversation?
Yeah, and this is an area in which understanding where we have those who believe in free speech and the like, we have kind of failed to understand what they're saying. We've been making arguments that are somewhat non-responsive, and I think, and I don't have a good response to them, but I at least understand what they're saying, which is it goes back to Herbert Marcuse in the 60s and this idea that Marcuse had, which was repressive tolerance. And basically his view was, consistent with what I was saying here, is that free speech favors the privileged. That free speech takes, in his case, it was class, right, because he was a Marxist. Now it's identitarian. But basically free speech takes, so-called free speech takes place in a given framework of what people see as their worldview. And so basically what he says is that free speech basically privileges those who are already privileged. And so it's not an equal playing field. And so his view was you need to repress, you need to keep those who are in positions of power from speaking and allow just the other side to speak. Right, because to try to rectify this power imbalance. And so their view, as you said, is they genuinely reject the fundamental premise of the liberal university, which is the idea of a shared search for truth, the idea that we are two individuals rationally trying to understand truth and coming to some agreement or at least understanding. They deny all of that. And they say all it is a vehicle for power. And so this is what leads them to these crazy and very, very dangerous ideas like speech is violence and violence is speech, right? Or that it's appropriate to use physical force to restrain speakers, or that speech itself can be harmful, right?
The entire idea of inclusion as it's used now seems to be to define certain speech as unacceptable, and,
right.
But then, it does seem to get you stuck in the situation where there's such a desire to have on what I guess we could say our side is like as big and open a conversation as possible. But can you really have a conversation with people whose sole purpose in the conversation is to somehow defeat you and silence you and use whatever administrative tools available? Are these just things that have to be separated completely?
That's exactly right, which is that they don't see a conversation as a conversation. They see a conversation as a kind of dominance interaction, which is either your ideas are prevailing or my ideas are prevailing, and there is zero-sum game, and they reject the rules we play by, right? So you mentioned evidence. What we think is, all right, well, there's a certain framework to the kind of arguments you make where you appeal to evidence that both people kind of objectively can look at and reach their own determination. But they reject that whole idea, right, which is they say that just makes some things more important than others. And so, for example, this is where you get this idea that sort of my narrative, my personal story and my subjective interpretation of the world is just as valuable as your multivariate regression, right? Because your multivariate regression is just subjective also. That's just what you think is proof. I think my personal story is just as compelling as your regression. So.
Yeah, and sometimes it's even, I think it may be even worse than that. So one of my favorite quotes I've plucked off from some of the discussions that I've heard is, "Don't let facts get in the way of effectiveness." So that is something that's actually taught. As part of how should you as a professor get your ideas out there? maintaining your integrity and sticking to facts is not actually admirable if it interferes with your ability to push this. And these,
that is a great point. And one of the things that that is really important about this is that one of the things that we see here is that that there are clear bounds on what are considered now acceptable academic research questions. Mm-hmm. And so for a long time, the people in the hard sciences, for example, just said, oh, well, that's also those goofballs over there in the English department, right? They're not going to touch here in biology and everything else, right? Well, it has crept over to that, to all those hard sciences. And you put your finger on why, which is that it's not that what they're especially concerned about is there are certain areas that are not allowed to be the subject of research, not because they might be false, but because they might be true, right? And that's exactly what you want to repress is ideas from science, for example, or economics or anything else that would reinforce what they see as the prevailing dominance hierarchy. And so that's what's scary about this is it's truth that they want to repress, not falsity.
There was recently a astronomy professor here tried to come up with a way to have objective metrics for early career success that would predict future success. And before anyone even saw the outcomes, they made him withdraw the paper or withdraw his book on the paper just out of the risk that his findings would not line up with their narrative. And I think it's shocking that's just considered okay. Right. Nothing happens to the people who started that campaign. No one says, you're not a real scientist, you don't belong here. They're the heroes because they've gotten this person to withdraw. It's stunning. I mean, I first read into this stuff when basically somebody ran a regression, got the wrong coefficient, and suddenly these investigated. It's
my God.
I mean, it really is that far. It's like facts are not what we're looking for. And then that sort of leads into sorry, did you have...
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, you think about this controversy over BLM, right? And these very prominent papers by Roland Fryer, the Harvard economist, on police shootings, for example. I would bet that if he had tried to publish those papers today rather than 3 or 4 years ago, whenever he published them, he couldn't get them published. Mm-hmm. Not no matter the fact that they are the state-of-the-art research on police use of force against criminal suspects, they get the wrong coefficient, as you say.
It's interesting how when you come up with those sorts of results, all sorts of other completely random allegations that are unrelated suddenly crop up. I've noticed that's a bit of a pattern. I mean, that is a mechanism. Like, if your coefficient goes one way, every last little bit of your personal life is going to be dragged out. Whereas if it goes the other way, you can get away with anything. So that, we can trust us. We can massage coefficients. It's not that hard. So if you put the incentive structure like that, I mean, it's easy to lie with econometrics.
Right.
And so if your life is ruined if you come up with a positive coefficient and you get a prize if you come up with a negative coefficient, guess what everyone's going to be doing? We don't have that much spine here.
We don't. That's true.
Possibly present company accepted. So I did want to hit, related to this and the sort of almost like the rotting out of the intellectual process, there's another element of like the enthusiasm for using kind of bureaucratic measures and capturing, like, we have things that are just, they're implicit rules on how these institutions work, and they're very excited about using research misconduct investigations over like things that make people feel marginalized, or they'll set up, they'll start reporting you as for harassment if you say something they don't like. So there doesn't seem to be a respect for the basic institutions that we've had, and this desire to capture them. Is that something you see in this?
Absolutely, yeah. And these tools, these formal process and stuff, kind of sit around like kind of a loaded gun, which is that they're there to deal with very particular cases, and then you end up routinizing them, or as we say now, weaponizing them to for other reasons. And this is one of the points I made about getting rid of or distrust of process-based rules, right? Which is a lot of this and all these questions we have now about institutional legitimacy are up in the air, whether it's the electoral process or I was shocked as a lawyer. I mean, it literally was flabbergasted that a large number of people on the left are talking about court packing the Supreme Court, which is just something I never thought we would be coming back to in this country, right?
But it lines up with the if everything is dominance and everything is power,
exactly,
and it's not about reaching equilibria where we can have these kind of balanced interests that worked for a while, right?
That's right. And so much of this, as you said, rests on these informal norms of how we interact and according to certain rules in a community. And a university has certain rules, right, which is traditionally, which is free speech. You follow the evidence where it goes. People are supposed to have a thick skin about ideas that make them, that threaten them. You counter speech with better speech, all these sorts of ideas. And what you're talking about now is deviating from those rules, defecting from those rules, which is basically saying if you're playing by those rules, I'm going to play by different rules, which is I'm going to invoke formal processes. I'm going to get you fired. I'm going to get you punished. I'm going to get you discredited, right? I'm going to make sure you don't get grad students and research grants and all that sort of stuff.
I'm going to throw smoke bombs at your event. Yeah, this has happened here once.
It has a really?
Not to us, but to another group on campus. Yeah.
Right. And so it's, and in their view, right, it's all justified because it's all power, as you said. It's win at all costs. And so they're allowed to use whatever they need to use. And now what's dangerous about this is that is an unstable equilibrium. If one side is essentially using, let's just call it force or coercion, right, through things like disciplinary processes and that sort of thing, the other side has a choice, which is either they continue to be pummeled, right, or they fight back. And it's inevitable at some point they're going to say enough, right? And then if people are still baffled as to why Donald Trump got elected president, that's the dynamic right there, right? Which is as clumsy as he was and as crude as he was, people said, at least this guy's fighting back. He's not like Mitt Romney and John McCain, right? That's the box that they put you in, is if they continue to use these processes and be aggressive, destroy people's careers, destroy people's reputations, it is inevitable at some point that people are going to stop taking it or they're going to start fighting back, in which case we have a benign outcome, which is equilibrium gets reestablished, but we also know as economists that can also lead to the Hatfields and McCoys.
Right. Yeah, I think that's striking. Some of the things that are going on here now, we've gone so far to the suppression of all of their ideas and the capture of the curriculum and turning it into activism, and then the moment anyone from outside says, oh, maybe it's time to right the ship, they get very upset about any possibility of reciprocity. But I wonder how long do they really think they can just wait, having cheated on all the rules, having gone from teaching to becoming activist trainers, and not expect. I mean, it's been decades where the what you would call the right has just sat around and let them do this. Eventually, you can't get that indignant that eventually someone's going, oh no, maybe we need to monitor this a little bit, but we'll see.
Yeah, and we keep seeing that, right? I mean, one of the things that's striking to me is, as a lawyer, is to follow the debate over judicial nominations in Mitch McConnell, which is, going all the way back to Robert Bork in the 80s. Bork, Thomas, the Democrats consistently changed the rules when it came to judicial nominations, right? First they trashed Bork, and then they did the surprise hit on Clarence Thomas. Then they filibustered judicial nominees under Bush. Then they reached a filibuster deal, and then they broke the filibuster deal, and then they did the nuclear option for judges in order to pack the D.C. circuit. And finally it came around, and McConnell first held up Garland, right? And basically everybody was outraged. And McConnell said, look, during the Bush administration, Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden said, if George Bush tries to nominate somebody, we're not going to have a confirmation hearing. And McConnell said, it turns out I believe them, which is they've pretty well established that they can be trusted when they say they're going to do something like that. So it's not up to me to sit here and pretend like they're playing by the rules when they wouldn't do it. And he said exactly the same thing when it came to the Barrett nomination, moving the Barrett nomination through the Senate. And what's so striking about it is the outrage that basically, oh my God, Mitch McConnell is playing by our rules, although they would never put it that way.
Well, and especially in academia, the outrage, there seems to be this instinct, even for people who are sort of on our side, to have this outrage at us for if you do, it's okay that they play by their nasty rules and defect all the time, but the moment anyone tries to push back, oh no, now we're just as bad as them.
We're just as bad as them.
If I see the word just as bad as them again, my head's going to
and a good example that I've written on is I did a piece a couple weeks ago in Newsweek called Cancel Culture Comes to Banking. So many of our listeners may be familiar with what's going on in Canada right now, where they have basically shut off the bank accounts of the truckers who are protesting. And I said a few weeks ago, this is going to happen. This is coming to the United States. And literally the day after I published that article, Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, got his bank account canceled. But this has been going on for a while, and it's inevitable, right? It's a tool they have.
And then you hear the criticism, but it's a private company, so they can do whatever they.
That's what. They say it's a private company, but here's my point, right?
Is not a private,
banking is pretty far from a private company, right? There's barriers to entry. There's all these restrictions.
Government oligopoly.
You try to start a bank and tell me what it's like, and so I think we really need to be thinking in terms and naively the response is, well, they would never do that because they know that if the shoe were on the other foot, that it would be used against them, and it never is, right? It's just like speech codes on campus. In theory, it could be used against the left, but in practice, everybody knows it's not for the reason you're saying.
It turns out the people who are committed to free speech in principle are less inclined to use. Who'd have thought? But we've got to, something has to restore.
Right, and so that's an unstable equilibrium, right? That at some point something has to give. Either you have to stop canceling other people's bank accounts, or it does in fact go both ways.
Yeah, I've wondered. There's such an asymmetry. Like if your political ideology controls an industry that's sort of oligopolistic and the network platforms, banking, you have this extra tool that allows you to implement your policies. Where if you're in a disaggregated industry, if the truckers could coordinate to deplatform their opponents, they would get anything they wanted immediately. But since that's not a concentrated industry, they can't pull that off. Jimmy Hoffa. Back in the day, so maybe we have to go back to something like that, where the sort of victims of the deplatforming figure out how to build their own ability to engage in the deplatforming. But when you start going down,
That's an ugly path. That's exactly
it's an ugly
the right
path,
word.
but it sure doesn't seem it sure seems less ugly than the path of just giving up all the time.
Yeah, and that's what scares me, right? It is an ugly path, and people ask me about this. They said, are we going to have two economies, a blue economy and a red economy? Are we going to have this constant tit-for-tat spiral? And my answer is, I hope not, but I don't have any better solutions. And, as I said, I talked about this cancel culture in banking and the issues involved in it and talked about some things. And people said two things. Number one was, well, aren't you afraid that if the left gets in power and we give them these tools, they'll be used against us? And my first response is, they're not waiting. They're already using it.
When was the last time they did not use a tool?
Yeah, well, it's like they're already using it. So, it's like it's not like they're waiting for us to give them this power because they're doing it already. But the second point is this is a dangerous game. It is a very scary thing to think about to play these tit for tat games and how bad they might go. But here's my view is. I don't know if it'll work or not. What I do know is that what we're doing right now is not working. If we keep doing what we're doing, then it's a one-way ratchet that just gets worse and worse, maybe more slowly than it otherwise would. But I am confident that, and I for a long time thought, well, it's like this is too dangerous. We need to just kind of play by the established rules. But I'm not persuaded that that's a successful strategy anymore when we're playing a completely different game, different asymmetric type game. And I'm not saying I have all the answers. What I do know is that what we're doing right now is not working, and we need another strategy.
So we don't have all the answers. Obviously, we're not going to fix society, but let's hone in. Like, what do we do about the universities? If we just finish, like, how if you had, like, just in a few lines, what do we do to create something that's actually worth operating, something that goes back to being something that creates value? I've been banging my head against this for a while. But
well, I would say, so the first thing is one thing I'm particularly proud of that we adopted at Antonin Scalia Law School, George Mason, where I teach. We adopted a statement of faculty principles, which goes beyond the Chicago principles. And our idea was to essentially make it actionable by students, to basically say, here's the rules of the game. That we are committed to free speech in the classroom. One of the points we made specifically in that is that that the classroom is inherently a power dynamic, right? Which is faculty have a legitimate claim to authority and hierarchy in the classroom in terms of what the curriculum is, what the syllabus is going to be. At the same time, that brings responsibilities on us not to abuse that. And so I think students have a right not to be proselytized in the classroom. And so I think trying to come up with some way of that working, and we tried to do that essentially at the law school. I think the second thing is it is really important to do the kind of things you guys are doing at the Salem Center, which is to create a group of faculty who can sort of provide an alternative viewpoint, but also they have to be people who have courage, who have tough skin, who are smart and are willing to stick their neck out in order to do it. I think that third, and related to that, is I think it really is going to have to be the case that new institutions will be founded, whether it is new departments on campus. Those are always dangerous because the administration is always so hostile to those sorts of things, or whether it's new universities or online universities or whatever the case may be. And of course, what you run up against there is the accreditation cartel. So I think, experimentation is really important. I'm not sure that I know what the answer is, but I do think that also I think being willing to use the tools that are available. As you said, the left has been willing to use those tools, and whether it is EEOC, whether in discrimination, whether it's pushing for state laws that protect political ideology as a protected class for employment, but also just sort of universities, all those sorts of things. I think that this idea of sort of thinking that government doing nothing is always the most protective of liberty is not necessarily a viable strategy. And perhaps it's the case that there are things where the small, the outliers, the small minorities in terms of sense of right now that people who believe in the free society are a minority among faculty on campuses. I'm not sure about with students, but giving them tools to be able to protect themselves from being discriminated against, fired, and all those sorts of things. That's the next frontier, I think, is what do we do about it? I'm not sure, and that's what I hope people will be talking about, coming up with solutions.
Well, then, to be continued. Todd, thank you very much. This has been great, and we'll see you next time.
Great.